Hello again, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing the series on Attacking the King, this time with Morphy's Mate. Paul Morphy, of course, was the greatest American chess player in chess history in the 1800s, prior, of course, to the 1900s when Bobby Fischer would become the next great American chess hero. Now, Paul Morphy has some great games during the Romantic period of chess, a lot of classical ideas, and in 1857, in a game at the New York tournament against Louis Paulsen, Morphy shocked the crowd when he sacrificed his queen for a knight, creating an attack on the open G file. And this is more of a technique than it is a specific mating pattern, and it can be seen throughout countless games. Here it is in its very simplified form. We can see that black has the traditional castled position, this time with the knight on f6, the primary defender, of course, defending this square here. And we're simply going to use this as a weakness in the position. Queen captures. Now, what's interesting to note is the battery, the bishop and the queen, threatening checkmate on g7. What this means is that black has no choice but to capture this queen to save himself, because if he was to, say, push the pawn forward, well, that doesn't stop the queen from entering this square or even this square and saying checkmate. So he has to take the queen. This opens up the G file, creates a hole in the position, which leads us to a check, stepping out of the way and delivering checkmate with the bishop. Okay, we'll also see in a moment here Morphy's concealed mate, as well as a variation of Morphy's mate called Pillsbury's mate, but we'll make a separate video for Pillsbury's mate. Okay. So hopefully you can see here now that the threat of being able to capture and forcing this pawn out, opening a lane, is very, very important. And so that's the theme. The theme is sacrificing to take out this main defender and misdirect this defending pawn, creating a hole in the defense. Well, Morphy's concealed mate is very, very similar. We can see now that we actually have two pieces attacking the critical G-pawn. And so there is no piece here for us to bother capturing to force this pawn to move. So we're going to take it by force, simply claiming check. Now, what you might notice here is that if this rook were to move anywhere, it would reveal a discovered check along the diagonal. Now, some people would say, why not just move this rook out of the way and think that maybe this is checkmate, seeing as how this rook covers all the escape squares. The problem with that is that this pawn can move forward being defended by this rook, and it's now blunting or blocking the bishop's attack, and the attack is completely destroyed here. It goes astray. So white has to be very creative. Can you figure out a great move for white here to keep the attack valid? Hopefully you found rook captures f7 check. So the discovered check is what allows the white rook to capture this pawn and not be worried about being taken back by this rook, because you have to resolve the check first. So after the king makes his only available move, the rook can come back in for check again because he's defended by this bishop. So once again, the king has nowhere to go but the corner. Now the rook can come out, revealing this check because that pawn no longer exists to create a block. And so the only move black has is to block with that rook, and now it's checkmate. So this is sort of a concealed version of Morphy's mate. What I want you to notice between this example and the previous example is that the checkmate is the rook is covering the escape squares while the bishop is delivering checkmate in the corner. And if we look at Morphy's concealed mate, it's the same thing. This rook is covering the escape squares while this bishop is attacking in the corner. Okay. Now we can compare that to Pillsbury's mate. And I mentioned we're going to make a separate video for Pillsbury's mate to go more into depth. However, what we're going to see with Pillsbury's mate is we have the same attacking here. But because we have this extra rook, we can win more quickly. The problem here is that this bishop is under attack. So if we try this tricky maneuver by simply moving over and discovering the check from the bishop, the problem is that the bishop can be taken by the queen. And after we take and they take, now we find ourselves down a pawn in an endgame that is likely to either be drawn, because this is a rook pawn and it's harder to promote, or black can promote to a queen and win the game. So we certainly don't want that to happen. So when we attack, and the king goes into the corner, Pillsbury's mate has us winning by force because we have this extra rook. And this is through the use of a double check. We double check with the rook and the bishop, forcing the king to respond. And then we continue with what looks like a Morphy's Mate opportunity. The difference here in Pillsbury's mate is that the rook is the one delivering the checkmate, while the bishop is the one covering the squares. So just a very, very subtle difference there. There is another variation against an uncastled king. Somewhere in the course of this game, before the diagram was made, the king decided to make a move as opposed to castling, leaving this rook in the corner. And what's important about this is having a rook that can cover the escape squares. And so again, in true Morphy fashion, we sacrifice to take out the defender on f6, luring the g-pawn away from their station, giving our check, and then there's the checkmate. And again, this one has the rook delivering the check, while the bishop is covering the escape squares from the opposite side. So all of these are what we'll call Morphy's mating technique, not necessarily a mate pattern, because you can see it develops in many different ways. Well, just for the fun of it, let's take a look at the famous game in 1857, Paulsen versus Morphy. Morphy had the black pieces, so we're going to see it from the black perspective. This game only lasted 25 moves, which, as you know, is a very short game of chess. Average games have more than 40 moves. And remember, it's not a set number of moves like a lot of mating patterns. We're just looking for his technique and his ideas. So we have the 4 knights opening here. And each player is developing their pieces. Keep in mind, we want to develop our pieces, attack the 4 center squares, and get our kings to safety. Those are our opening ideas. So both sides have done that. One of the things in the opening is we still have pieces here that have yet to develop on both sides. And so you really want to avoid moving the same piece 2 or 3 times. You'd rather move each piece once and get the entire army into play. So white makes an interesting move here, moving the same piece twice. This knight is already moved once from its starting square, and now it's in the center of the board. So black develops a piece by attacking with tempo, and then white moves it again. This knight has moved 1, 2, 3 times only to be traded off. So he's losing time, he's losing tempo. This bishop, which has already moved once, is now going to move a second time, and now a third time. So black is gaining in time, gaining in speed, getting his pieces into the game, while white seems to be wasting moves. I would say that's really the thing I would learn from this game more than anything else. Black continues to develop, getting his pieces into the game. White thinks he makes a strong attack here. It's easily defended with this move, covering that pawn. And that's kind of an odd move. It doesn't develop any of these pieces. I understand it's getting ready to attack the center, but it's just too slow after wasting so many moves. And it created a weak square. You've heard me say before that amateurs look at the pieces on the board, masters look at the squares on the board. And if we back that up for just a moment, this pawn was the only thing defending this square. And when they moved it, they created a hole in their defenses, and black just seizes that hole. And if you're Morphy, you know what you're looking at. So attacking, trying to do something on the queen side, really moving a lot of pieces to the queen side, not leaving many defenders around this king. This king only has 2 defenders. So continuing to develop, bringing in all of our pieces, making sure we have everything that we need. And I don't know what white's doing here. He's continuing to move on the queen side, and sure, he's offering a queen trade, but he just keeps moving his pieces further and further away from his king. And there it is, Morphy's mating technique. Sacrifice to capture either the f3, in this case, defender. If colors were reversed, it would have been the piece on f6, the traditional defending position. Removing a defender from the king, The crowd went wild, wondering what in the world was Morphy doing, but Morphy was ripping open the king's position, allowing the check down the open g-file, bringing his bishop into the fray, being able to check, defended by this rook, recapturing, and look at this monster bishop. It is covering so many key squares around the king, and we have both of our rooks staring into the position, not to mention we have this extra bishop over here. All of our pieces are looking at white's king, and there's no defenders anywhere. Look at this. All of his potential defenders are nowhere near the king, and yet we have one bishop looking in, two bishops looking in, a rook staring at him, a rook cutting off all these escape squares. Everything is surrounding this king, bringing in more pressure on this square. Check. Double check. Remember the bishop. Checkmate. Because this bishop defends that rook, which is covering the back line, and this bishop covering the squares. All right, so if we back that up a few moves, don't mind all these interesting moves, what was the key to Morphy's success? What you want to remember that we learned from Paul Morphy is that we're attacking the defender on the f3 or f6, depending on what color you're playing. And that's going to lure the g-pawn away. Excuse me. There we go. Which allows us now the open g-file in combination with the bishop. The bishop and the rook work excellent together on the open g-file. And now we're just maneuvering this king around. In its simplest form, we can go back to the very beginning and we can see, pardon me, we can go back to the very beginning in its simplest form and see how sacrificing to take out the defender on f opens up the g and allows the bishop and the rook to work together. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at these ideas. You know, we looked at the basic sacrifice here on f6, Morphy's concealed mate. We compared it to Pillsbury's mate with the double check sacrifice. We looked at it with a variation against an uncastled king. There were a lot of ideas here, and watching the video one time lets you learn about something, but it doesn't mean that you really know it well. So remember, you are what you repeat. So repeat these positions time and time again. Practice them over the board. Set up your pieces and go through the motions so that you can just remember them. Practice them with a friend. Watch the video multiple times until they become a part of your game. Well, until next time, I am Zach Wilson with the Hood County Chess Club. We'll see you real soon.